Good day. In this day, I'm going to talk about the top 10 most common mistakes while building your star answers. And right from the start, I have access to over 10,000 of your stories, from freshers to VPs. Okay, so let's start with the easy stuff here. The number one thing you'd want to avoid building your star answers will be to word them using AI. Okay, so wording your answers using AI will not work, will actually make you decline in performance during your job interviews. I explain this at length in various other videos. I even work with people developing these LLMs, and they never use AI to prepare the job interviews, by the way. And if you want a fix here, the best use case for AI to prepare job interviews would be to use it as an agent or as a co-pilot, if you want to go with the trends. In other words, to generate some reports with some hopefully useful feedback about your answers, right? On my paid services, I actually have this feature since April of 2024, okay? The second thing you'd want to avoid in your star answers would be vague situations. So not presenting the situation clearly enough, right? So what happens here is that oftentimes candidates, because they want to hurry, either while brainstorming for their star answers, either during the interviews, they just start with omitting the situation. Stuff such as, when did this happen? Or what was your role with that specific company? And oftentimes people even forget to mention the specific company that they were working on, right? Now, what would be the fix to present a more specific situation during your star answers? Well, actually, there is a document, something that's called a star worksheet, that for each of the situation, task, action, and results would present you with a number of follow-up and challenge questions to help you to make your answers considerably more specific, right? So where did this occur? When did it happen? Why is this important, right? So this is how you fix this problem. The third thing I like to talk about here is that expectations greatly differ by the role you're applying for, okay? For example, a software engineer is expected to frame their answers in the star format, and this will actually most likely benefit them during job interviews because they're not assumed to be really good with these things, right? In contrast, if you're applying for a director level role, in my experience, the star template is likely to break things with respect to the way you communicate the idea you want to transmit, because it's a template. So it's gonna template the way you speak, and if you're good at speaking, templating it will not make it better, right? It's like making a masterpiece as a template. It's a unique thing the way you're communicating, so that's why it would alter your performance. So careful with how you set yourself expectations from this star format, right? The fourth thing I like to talk about here would be a mistake that people often make when doing star answers would be to answer non-behavioral questions using the star format. For example, tell me about yourself. Okay, your introductory statement. There's no need for it to put it in the star format, of course, unless you insist. You could put anything in a star format if you so wish, but it doesn't sound as good in the star format. There's other frameworks if you want, but the star is not one of them, right? Now, a use case, maybe a less intuitive use case for the star format would be, what's your weakness? So what's your weakness? You could pitch a weakness that you want, I don't know, whichever public speaking, okay? But the idea is that you pitch that weakness with a great story, and that story could be, of course, in a star format, right? So implying a star format in your subsequent communication does work, but answering non-behavioral questions is not usually a good idea to use the star format for, right? Number fifth mistake you'd want to avoid building your star answers and delivering your star answers in job interview would be low quality or flat interview or star answers due to volume thinking. Okay, so in other words, simply put, there's candidates who make it a goal to build their story bank of 50 stories. Okay, I have nothing against if you prepare 50 stories for a job interview, but in my experience, the best story banks or the best answers are not the ones that you brainstorm for the first time, but rather the ones that you revise at least 3 times. And the problem is that if you have too many stories, like 50, you will not have time to revise them 3 times. Okay, so you'd rather go on something like 10 or 15 stories revised 3 times rather than 50 stories which you'll never revise. So prioritize quality over quantity when it comes to your star answers, because there's tremendous value you could bring from there. And another quick note here, with respect to volume thinking, the difference between a story and a star answer is that a story usually starts as a brain dump. In other words, you start writing 2 pages of whatever you remember about a specific event in your career, and then you trim down the fat, which eventually you'll sharpen into a star answer. Okay, a star answer, if you start that without the brain dumping process, chances are it will lack some interesting details that you like to communicate, and that therefore that sensation that it might sound a bit flat, right? So prioritize quality and revisions over quantity. Okay, the 6th thing I'd like to talk about here is oftentimes candidates, especially when you're getting started with brainstorming for your stories, and when you're not really used to speaking in the star format, you'll have a tendency to be too long in the situation and the task. So in other words, the way you describe the situation will take over half of your answer, right? You could easily check if you have this problem, but the fix here is quite simple in the sense that you'd have to combine situation and task. Okay, you could even call them a challenge. You combine them together, and usually, that's how people manage to go a bit quicker in presenting the description by, combining these things and making your answer sound a bit sharper, so to speak, right? Scenario number 7 that you'd want to avoid building star answers would be presenting with hypothetical answers or with vague answers in generally speaking. This problem stems from the question you're trying to answer, because what happens for instance, how do you prioritize? Okay, it's an open-ended question, and most of the time people will be inclined to give an open-ended answer. Hey, usually I prioritize like this, and then you think about, but I have to put it in the star format. Okay, and then the result would be that my boss is happy, okay, with the way I prioritize, which is basically, you're presenting a broad and open-ended story, and even a hypothetical story, because your assumption was that, hey, if they ask me a hypothetical or an open-ended question, my answer could be the same. When in fact, if you want to be good with behavioral interviews, you'll have to always sell yourself on your best stories. And your best stories will always be specific ones. Specific examples in your past experience that should serve as a great predictor of success in your future role. Okay, so long story short, read between the lines of the question you're getting asked, and when building your star answer, try to build specific examples of when you exhibited that specific behavior, right? Point number 8, clarity of thought. Okay, so one of the key reasons why the STAR method was invented was to help people to communicate ideas that they want to transmit more coherently, in a structured way, more easier to understand. Now, in my experience, it still happens that candidates are often unintelligible, even without them realizing. Okay, so if you suspect yourself that you are in this field, in this camp, so to speak, then my advice would be to really spend a little bit of time on your ability to self-assess. Okay, the best candidates in job interviews are always able to self-assess their performance. Am I intelligible? Am I communicating the idea that I want to transmit clearly with these things? Because believe it or not, it happens more often than people realize, that not to understand what the candidate that I'm coaching, for instance, is talking about, or simply because they're not adapting what they communicate to whom they're interviewing with. For instance, you're never going to present an answer the same way to a peer in a technical field who's in the same technical field as you, the same way you'll communicate it to a recruiter, right? Or an interview coach like me. Okay, I'm not a subject matter expert, so you would have to adapt your communication style in such a way that I understand it. But clarity of thought is something that will greatly benefit your performance if you manage to think in these terms, like you use the STAR format in a bit to improve your clarity of thought. Okay, number 9, bluffing. Okay, so bluffing does still happen quite a lot when people build their STAR answers in the story banks. Maybe the 2 most common scenarios with bluffing in the STAR answers would be lack of ownership, when you're trying to sound more senior than you actually are, and there's various combinations of rewarding your answers using AI so you sound even better. And the other very common scenario is when you copy entire examples, AI examples, for instance, of conflicts. Because what happens is some people don't have conflicts. They worked all their life remotely, or they worked in non-conflictual, in low-performing environments. So they must find something, so they would copy someone else's. But bluffing is something that you should pay particular attention to, because for someone who's doing this all day long, including myself, hearing these things, it's far easier than most of you realize to catch these, right? And finally, the 10th thing I like to talk about here when it comes to mistakes, when it comes to building your STAR answers, would be prioritizing your investment in the STAR answers. So many of you might be overthinking the value of these STAR answers. Because what happens in a job interview, preparing these job interviews, there's 2 things that matter, is your story bank and your interviewing skills. So what happens here is that some people become so proficient at building their story banks, they have some amazing story banks, and then when you try to role play or when they go to an interview, they simply crash. They totally fail, because they enjoyed so much the process of building their STAR answers and perfectioning the STAR answers that they lost, that spontaneity that is, that it's oftentimes achieved through role play and through actual hands-on practicing your interviewing skills, right? So always self-assess. Where is your time best spent? Because sometimes, you might want to do a bit of volume thinking because you don't have enough stories. You might also want to focus other times on the quality of your stories. And sometimes it's better, to focus on practicing these things, because practice makes perfect, so to speak. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.